Welcome to Love Your Library, Hampshire Libraries podcast. I'm Mary Stone here with my co-host Kate Price-McCarthy. Hello, Kate.
Hi, Mary.
I'm delighted to be introducing our fourth full-length podcast, which this time comes from Ringwood Library, right on the edge of the New Forest.
We've been supplementing our full-length podcast with a few mini podcasts and even a children's special over the summer holidays. Look out for them if you haven't already taken a listen.
Talking of our children's specials, a hearty well done to the 26,000 children who took part in Hampshire Library's Summer Reading Challenge this year.
That is an incredible number. Anyway, on to today's podcast, which we're starting with guest author Tracy Chevalier, who'll be talking to us about her latest book. And then we'll be talking to staff here at the library who've got book recommendations they'd like to share.
This episode's title is inspired by Tracy's book, A Single Thread, which is set in and around Winchester Cathedral in the early 1930s. It shows the challenges faced by single women, or surplus women as they were termed at the time, charming,
I know,
who were trying to make a living and to be independent. Shocking.
Tracy is the author of 10 novels, including the hugely successful Girl with a Pearl Earring, which has sold over 5 million copies, and was made into the famous film, of course, starring Hampshire's own Colin Firth and Scarlett Johansson. Tracy was born in Washington, D.C., but moved to England in her 20s and has stayed here ever since. She's always been fascinated by cathedrals and decided to centre her latest novel on Winchester Cathedral, as well as on embroidery, bell ringing, and an irrepressible heroine.
Let's hear what Tracy had to say when you met up with her at Winchester Cathedral. First, we're going to hear a short reading from her new novel.
One evening after work, Violet sat in the cathedral presbytery, inspecting a kneeler to see how the broderer had blended the blues and considering how to do the same with the yellows and the borders she was working on. As she pulled at the stitches, someone took the seat next to her. She was startled to find it was Louisa Pessel and let out a little yelp, then apologized. Miss Pessel smiled. "I like to come here sometimes, just to sit and look." Violet nodded. It felt like having a member of the royal family choose to sit by her, the one wearing a brown turban trimmed with a tuft of feathers. "Sometimes I wonder if we couldn't use even more color here. It's so dark, especially in the choir stalls." Miss Pessel nodded at the wood stalls to their left. "The stone and wood just soak it up, even the mustard yellow some are complaining about." "People are complaining?" "Oh, yes." Miss Pessel's laugh was like a low bell ringing through the presbytery. "They say it's vulgar and inappropriate in a religious setting." "Have you always embroidered?" "Since I was a girl, yes. And then I taught it, here and abroad, and that rather set me on the path for life. During the war, I taught embroidery to convalescent soldiers. Do you know, Miss Speedwell, sewing can be so therapeutic when one has had trauma. The bold colors and the repetition of simple stitches had such a soothing effect on the men. There is something about creating a thing of beauty that worked wonders on their nerves. I was very pleased with the results." She nodded at the kneeler in Violet's lap. "Which pattern are you working on over the summer?" "Oh, I'm not making a kneeler. Mrs. Biggins has assigned me to make borders for the cushions, lengths and lengths of borders." "Would you like to make a kneeler?" "I would." "I'm curious, Miss Speedwell, why? There will be over 300 kneelers, so yours would get lost in the crowd, whereas there will be far fewer cushions, and they'll be very striking. And the borders, of course, will be essential to make them three-dimensional. There's no shame in sewing borders." "I know, it's just..." Violet stopped. "You want to make something wholly yours that will be seen properly and used." "Yes, I suppose I'm looking to start again here." Violet glanced around at the high stone walls and the vast space above them. But a cathedral is overwhelming, spiritually as well as physically. I thought if there was one small part of me here, that might help. A contribution that would make me feel connected, and something I could actually use, or that others could use. A border of a cushion is not quite the same as a kneeler. Miss Pessel nodded. What you say reminds me of the many people I see who come here and light a candle. That one flame in the great expanse of the cathedral. They look at it, come back to it. It is theirs. Yes, but a kneeler lasts longer than a candle. Indeed. All right then. Miss Pessel stood and gestured at the kneelers on the chairs around them. Choose the design you would like to make.
And normally, when I talk to an author, I say, right, we want to have a really quiet room, no echoes, which really distract. But we've got the opposite here because we are in the vast Winchester Cathedral. But it's for the very best reasons, because I felt that the cathedral was almost one of the characters in the story. And you've obviously spent a lot of time here.
I have, yes. I wandered around quite a lot over the course of the last 3 years, soaking in the atmosphere, finding out about details, finding about history, taking tours, going up into the bell chamber, all sorts of things. And I feel I do know it well. Yeah. And it's got its own unique atmosphere. I mean, I think cathedrals are very different, you feel the same thing when you go in often, but each one has its unique character.
And could you tell us a bit about the story about this, your latest book?
Yes, it's set in from 1932 to 34, and it's about a woman named Violet Speedwell, who's 38 years old, unmarried, and that's important. She lost her fiancé in World War I and has been living with her parents in Southampton. And after her father dies, she decides she's getting fed up with her overbearing mother, and she thinks, I've got to get a life for myself. At that time, unmarried women there was very few options. You could be a teacher, a nurse, a typist, and Violet is a typist, and she gets a job at an insurance company in Winchester. And one day she goes in to the cathedral choir and she comes upon a service, and it turns out to be a service blessing some embroidered kneelers that have been made by a group of women. And she slowly gets drawn into this group and begins doing embroidery herself and opens up her life to both the cathedral, to the city, and to the many characters who she discovers making their own lives.
Mm. And I know that often with you it's the research that will start off a book, your thinking process. So can you remember what the first bit of research was that you...
Yes, I knew I wanted to write a cathedral novel because I love cathedrals, and I was trying to figure out which cathedral. And I had been to Winchester a couple of times, and I remembered that there were really interesting stories attached to the cathedral concerning Oliver Cromwell's soldiers in the Great West Wall, Great West Window being broken, about William Walker, the diver in the 20th century who dived under and shored up the foundations. Jane Austen is buried here. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do one of those. So there were all these different stories that I could make into a novel easily. So I had a look around, and then I came upon a display about the embroiderers of Winchester Cathedral, and how in the early 1930s a group of volunteer women made hundreds of cushions and kneelers for the choir stalls that are still in use. And there was just something about them that really appealed to me, and I thought, I wonder what it was like to be in that group. I want to write about them. So that was the spark that I had.
And you've talked before about getting your hands dirty when you do research. So is there a sampler of needlepoint that you've...
I have one in my bag. Funny you should ask. I knew somebody would ask at some point. So in the book, at one point, Violet makes, the embroidery they do is called canvas embroidery, and it's basically needlepoint. And at one point, Violet has really gotten into it, and she makes a spectacles case for her mother for Christmas or for her birthday, and her mother just kind of drops it on the ground. And I made the needle case myself.
It's beautiful, and it's got colours of
it's sort of purple and
beige and purple,
pink and blue.
And using, I'm trying to remember the rice stitch, is it? Is
that rice? Well done. Yes, you've been. And then I added some other stitches. This is Florentine, and this is Hungarian diamonds. But I fiddled around with and then there's long arm cross along there, and then I made a needle case. She makes a needle case for her niece, Marjorie, and this is the needle case she makes for her, and I
Marjorie's
use it myself.
needle case becomes a central part in the plot.
Yeah, it does. And so I wanted to make them so that I would be able to describe more accurately how it's done.
Yeah, and get a sense of the feel of them. And I'm fascinated by your writing process, the fact that you write longhand with a disposable fountain pen, and that I understand you have a different notebook for each story, each book that you write. Did you have a special notebook for a single thread?
I had a notebook. It wasn't special. Usually, I used to sort of try to find a themed notebook. But for some reason, I started the research at a time when I didn't have a chance to go out and find one, so I just looked in my cupboard of notebooks, because I often get them. And I used a kind of turquoise colored one, but it doesn't really have anything to do with it, sadly. But maybe next time.
No needlepoint on it. Yeah. I've heard you talk a bit about how it's quite hard it is to write about historical, societal injustices without trying to kind of redress them yourself. And there was several instances in this book, particularly when she's talking to her boss, or at the time when the doctor is almost refusing to talk, the mother's doctor is almost refusing to talk to her rather than the head of the household. And it's quite difficult to rein in our own modern.
There was a lot of casual sexism at the time. Women had very little socioeconomic or political power, and this came out in day-to-day contact. So, for instance, Violet works as a typist in an insurance company with two young women, and the assumption is the moment you marry, you don't work anymore. So you leave your job, and it's not law, but nobody would stay on to work, and it would be a shock if you did. And also they're paid less, and they're not meant to ask for more money or more power or have any ideas of their own. So her boss, Violet's boss, is a bit astonished when she does suggest some time-saving measures, and he says, "Oh well, I'll ask the hires up, but let it come from me. It's going to be let it be my idea, because it wouldn't do to have a girl think of that." So there's an awful lot of that kind of casual sexism, which may be surprising now, but it's certainly, I actually had a lot of fun writing it. But it's easier to have fun writing it when you don't experience it anymore than it would be at the time.
Well, even among the women, there is a sense that among the, now I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, the broderers, the women who are doing the needlepoint, that it's the married women that talk more than the single women because they have a higher status.
You know, I wrote that, and a couple of people who read the book said, who are single women, said that's still the case, that single women just are not listened to in the same way that married women are. And I was really shocked, because I thought, because I'm married, so I don't really know. And it pains me to think that women who have either chosen not to marry or for whatever reason have not married, that somehow should have an influence on how we listen to them.
Yeah, we've come a long way, but I remember you talking about how the feeling of being a little bit nervous walking on your own as a woman on your own from Winchester to Salisbury, it still daunted you, and that really resonated with me as well.
Yes, and my character Violet has a summer holiday where she walks the Clarendon Way between Winchester and Salisbury, and I did it too to make sure I got everything right and to get the atmosphere right. And I went with my husband, but I had an opportunity just to do it on my own, and I thought, oh no, I don't think I really want to. What would I do if I was in a field and a cornfield and ran into a man on his own, which is exactly what happens to Violet. And you would think 80-something years later, we would have gotten over that fear, but no.
Yeah, absolutely. I was coming, as I am from Hampshire Libraries, I was really interested to hear that the impact libraries had on you as a child. And and you still have a connection very much with libraries now, with your trusteeship of one of the trustees
Library.
for the British Library.
I'm a trustee of the British Library, which is like the dream job for me because I've used the British Library for 30 years and for research and writing, and I love it there. And I also have a huge fondness for libraries because that was the source of books for me when I was growing up. I used to go to the public library in Washington, D.C. every week and get new books, and I knew the children's librarian very well. I was sort of her pet, and she would set aside books for me, and we'd talk books, and that was really important to me, and it still is.
And do you think now we have to be more active to get children involved in reading than we used to?
I think so. There's an awful lot of competition from other devices and games and screens, really. But I think kids still love being read to when they're young, and I think parents have a responsibility to read to them. And we started reading to our son when he was about 2 months old, and just the turning of the pages, they get used to it. They get used to having books around, and kids love having stories told to them. So I think that, and then that joy when they learn to read and start reading for themselves, and they read chapter books, and it's a wonderful feeling. And I think that we mustn't assume that just because there are games to be played on your iPad, that means that every kid doesn't want to read. I think they do still want to read. We just need to encourage them, partly by adults around them reading.
Yeah,
because we read less, I think.
And we tend to read at the end of the day when we're sitting up in bed, when we're on our own, and our children don't see us do it.
Yeah, so after dinner, which I think everyone should eat together, I'm very old-fashioned in that way, and I think it's important to eat together. Maybe instead of watching television or all going onto your devices, you just say, let's all read for half an hour in the living room. It's not that hard to do.
My final question is actually probably not something I'd use for the podcast at all, but it's a question I promised my daughter that I would ask, which is, my daughter's doing A-levels at the moment. She's doing English literature as one of them, and she's doing women in literature. And they get given, as well as their main books they study, some excerpts from important books about women in literature or interesting studies of women in literature.
Yeah.
And one of them was The Girl with the Pearl Earring. Oh. And she had to analyse it and look at the role of women and the position of women and her powerlessness. It was the time when she was having her cap removed and having the scarf put on, and how she didn't want to be seen with her hair uncovered. And we were having this interesting conversation of, because it was set in the 17th century, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But obviously written in the late 20th century. So can we look at it from a perspective of how women were, their women's roles in that time? Or should we be sort of taking a sort of 2 steps beyond and seeing it as 20th century perception of 17th century?
I think it's impossible to put aside entirely your 20th century view, 21st century view when you as a reader. It's almost impossible. But I think it's important to remember that the women in that novel lived in the 17th century, and they had 17th century views, so they weren't going to question a lot of things. And when the main character has to take her cap off in front of her employer, she really doesn't want to. And that's not a judgment. We shouldn't be judging that. It's what was expected at the time, and she genuinely felt that it was taking away her power to remove her cap, that she was revealing something to him. It was like taking her clothes off in front of him. And that was a 17th century feeling that I don't think we should necessarily judge.
Well, that's really interesting to hear, because having 9 months ago discussed it with my daughter, to now hear it from you is she'll be very pleased that I asked that.
That was a fascinating interview, Kate. Tracy's got such a rich voice, and I love listening to her talk about her books. You talked a little bit about the recording and the quality. You're a bit concerned recording in that big echoey space, but it actually sounded fantastic.
I know, as I said in the interview, we always try and choose a place that's got no echoes at all, and suddenly I was in the choir of Winchester Cathedral. But what a fascinating place to do an interview. And it also meant I had a chance to have a good look around the cathedral's embroidered, or rather, as she says, needle-pointed kneelers and cushions, which Tracy talks about so interestingly in the book. I'm sure anyone who reads the book will then be desperate to go and have a look at the cushions of the cathedral.
So now it's time for the second part of our podcast. It's our book recommendations from staff here at Ringwood Library.
For this episode, we took our book choice theme from our love of libraries.
There's a huge fan base of authors who have a strong affection for libraries too, and we're always grateful for their support. They're inspired by libraries as children and then go on to appreciate them even more as published authors, just as Anne Cleves talked about in one of our earlier podcasts.
There's a ton of books that have been written which feature libraries and librarians, such as Alan Bennett's The Uncommon Reader, or The Eyre Affair by Jasper Fforde, or The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which is all about secrets hidden in libraries. And then there's The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak.
There's also Audrey Niffenegger's book, The Time Traveller's Wife, which centres on a librarian, and Terry Pratchett's Librarian of the Unseen University Library, who appears in almost every one of his Discworld books.
And there's a couple of library-themed books which have come out quite recently. Ali Smith's book, Public Library, was fascinating, and The Library of the Lost and Found by Phaedra Patrick.
So we opted for a 2018 novel by Salley Vickers called, aptly, The Librarian. And you'll hear what we thought about the book in the next section of the podcast, where Kate talks to Tina and Sue at Ringwood Library about books they recommend.
With me today at Ringwood Library are two members of the library team here, Tina Sismy and Sue Shepherd. Tina, I'm going to turn to you first. What is your book selection?
Hello, Kate. My first choice today is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck.
And it's a kind of 1930s book, isn't it?
It is. It's set around the Great Depression, and it's a really touching tale of friendship between two men. They have a dream of having their own land and their own farm. But unfortunately, one of the gentlemen, whose name is Lenny, who is a giant of a man, but has really this sort of a very childlike attitude, he can get into a lot of trouble. He does have a fixation with something soft. His dream is to keep rabbits because he finds the fur so soft.
And these two, George and Lenny,
yes,
they arrive at this farm to
They
work.
do, yes, they do, because they have been in a sort of problem in the previous farm where unfortunately Lenny got them into serious trouble and they've had to run from. So they have now arrived because they're desperate for work, desperate for food, and they've now arrived at this other farm and hoping to start afresh and hoping to save some money so they can follow their dream.
It's quite short.
It is. It's a short read. It's a really rich read.
It is, isn't it?
It is. It's the
characters,
depth of characters
Yeah.
that you can... They're so tangible.
Yeah.
And I love the personalities and I love the true friendship between the two men.
Yes.
George takes the adult role and Lenny is very childlike, and you can see how George struggles with that and how he has this caring and compassion for Lenny. He sees him for what he is, and he sees how other people misuse him and abuse him in many ways.
But they are kind of codependent on each other as well to stop themselves being lonely.
Yes.
And loneliness figures in all the characters. Particularly the
Curly's wife. Yes.
Who is the son of the owner of the farm.
Yeah, desperate
his
for
wife.
attention, isn't she?
And you never know her name. She's just Curly's
That's
wife.
right, yes.
And
but she's quite a character. You can form a character of her coming into the barn, and you get this sense of danger when she's around, because you just know that it spells trouble.
And there's a strong sense of people's dreams in this as well. Their dreams, not as dreams when they go to sleep, but what they would love to have.
A real pipe dream, isn't it?
And George and Lenny are just longing to have this
Absolutely.
homestead.
And for once, it may be that this dream could come about.
Yes.
And you can feel the excitement rising, that actually this wonderful dream might become a reality. And that is so bittersweet, because you always walk this tightrope of just let them fulfill this dream. If they could just fulfill the dream, everything would be all right.
I remember reading in the introduction to the book that John Steinbeck was saying that what is the really important theme of this book is that it's all about understanding people.
Yes.
And once you understand people, then you don't hate them anymore. You can understand why they've done what they've done. And I think that's why you don't come away depressed. This book is sort of enriching, because you do get to understand these two main characters so much that you can sense what their dreams, what their ambitions, their loneliness.
Yes.
And as a result of that, you come to these broken characters, you do come to like them and understand them. And Sue, had you come across the book before?
Only through school days, and it wasn't on my syllabus, but I remember other year groups studying it for school. What struck me was the American Depression years, the fact that life was so hard, that the men had no work, they had no food. They all travelled south towards the area where they thought there would be work, but obviously so many of them did that. There was no work, no food.
And there's a sense
really hard.
There's a sense of powerlessness about these people as well, that they work and don't really get anywhere. We've been talking about Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Okay, so I'm going to turn to you now. What book are you going to tell us about?
I have been reading The Librarian by Salley Vickers. Lots of people say you've got to read this book. There was quite a hype around it, considering we work in a library service, and it was about a children's library.
I was really keen to read it because I've read some of Salley Vickers' other books, particularly Miss Garnet's Angel is one of my absolute favourites, just adore it. And I was really interested to see what her perspective of a librarian would be. But this is set in the 1950s, isn't it?
Yes, it's very much travel back in time to the 50s. It evokes all the way through the book a feeling of that period where you know that those people are true characters. You've got the busybodies and the neighbours over the fence. You've got everybody knowing everybody's business. So it really evokes the time.
So it's this young woman, Sylvia. She comes to this small Wiltshire town, East Mole it's called, and she's heading up the children's section of the library. And I've heard it described as being like the dream novel for people who love books.
Yes, because she mentions through her text lots of other famous children's books and adult books. So there's a reading list actually at the back. So if you've been excited by what you've read through in her books, she's given you the list to read on.
Great idea. And I understand that this book is, although it's fictional, it's based on a librarian that Salley Vickers knew when she was a child. So she's even got the same name as this librarian.
I believe, because it has been said many times that children's interest in libraries starts often with the children's librarians that they see and get, that she's actually the Lady Sylvia is giving throughout the book ideas for those children to read and read on. And she's growing those children in their imaginations.
And so, Tina, how do you think working in the 1950s library of Salley Vickers' time, in Salley Vickers' book, how do you think that compares with a real library today?
Well, I would really like to compare notes in a sense that she was so enthusiastic and so positive around growing the children's library and encouraging getting in contact with her community and trying to get more children to come into the library, which of course is something
what we are doing
we're
today.
doing now.
Yes.
And when we have the children in the library, we love to talk to them and encourage them to look at different authors. And so we can equate to that excitement. We love that. In terms of the actual character, I loved her enthusiasm, but I thought she was very naive. And
I guess she is only 26.
Yes, exactly. So she's very young, so we can forgive her for that, really. Partly.
Yes. I felt the whole ethos of the book was that she wanted to believe that everyone would read and enjoy their books and had a purpose and passion for reading. So when she hooks up with her relationship problems and things start to go, wrong for her, the thing that really struck me was that she lost all of her final love and trust in the man. When he actually lied to her about saying that he'd read a book and finished it, and she realised he hadn't.
Yeah.
So that for her was the greatest
Absolutely.
final straw and disappointment that he actually hadn't finished the book, and he lied that he had so.
Yeah.
So that was the end of her
Quite
love
right
for
too.
him.
Yeah.
That's quite good.
I'd really enjoyed the book, although I wasn't so keen on some of the characters in it. Some of them I loved, but some of the characters I wasn't so keen on. I was a bit uncomfortable with the epilogue, which I won't say what happens in the epilogue because I don't want to give spoilers. But I love the feeling when you get to the end of the book and the story finishes, and sometimes it's a bit ambiguous and you don't know what's going to happen in their lives, but you can kind of flesh it out in your own mind. And so I can see what she was trying to affect, that at the end of the book it comes up to present day, and that does give her a chance to talk about the role of libraries in present day lives, which was useful. But it did mean that you got to see what had happened to all these characters.
But sadly, not our key characters.
Yeah,
She doesn't
well, maybe that was
mention the
maybe
key
that was a good
characters.
thing.
She picks on a quite low-level character in the earlier book.
Maybe that was so she wasn't ruining our own imagination.
Our imaginations of what had happened next to those people, yes.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
I think in some books that kind of epilogue does work. I just felt slightly disappointed with the whole book, and actually at the end of it I didn't really feel the need to find out anything more about the characters involved, really.
Yeah, I finished the book thinking actually I must try some more of her books. Because I've been hearing some really good things about The Cleaner of Charge, which sounds really interesting, and I haven't read that.
Absolutely, even know. So
absolutely.
maybe that's something we need to now
Yes,
embrace.
I think so.
The
And I
next
think
book.
this one is quite different to some of her other books. So perhaps by not having such enthusiasm for this one, bit of a bumpy read, maybe an alternative book of hers we will have a lot more passion for.
We've been talking about The Librarian by Salley Vickers. I'm Kate Price-McCarthy, and you're listening to the Hampshire Libraries podcast, coming today from Ringwood Library. Okay, we're now going to talk about my choice, which is The Lido by Libby Page. This book, which came out last year, it's a very new book, and I couldn't believe it's actually a debut novel by by the writer Libby Page. She's done phenomenally well, because I think there were bidding wars and all sorts for when the book came out, and it's now in all sorts of languages, where the film rights are out and so on. So, and it has been a kind of big smash bestseller. But what it's about a 26-year-old reporter called Kate, so another young woman coming to a new town, so quite a similar theme, but this time she's coming to Brixton, the area within London, and what she does is she joins forces with an 86-year-old widow called Mary to help save the local Lido, the local open-air swimming baths. And she really makes a huge effort to capture the spirit of Brixton. There's loads of vivid description in it of all sorts of bits and pieces of Brixton. And it's got a real sense of the value of community and the importance in society of community. Community spaces as well. Places like Lido's, open air swimming pools where people hang out in the sunshine, but also about libraries. So yet again, library comes up as an important theme. The woman in her 80s, Rosemary, she used to work in a library when she was younger, and she loves books. But it's also got a really important topic of loneliness. But it's loneliness from two very different perspectives, one of which is the perspective of this 86-year-old woman who's lost her beloved husband, who was her absolute soulmate. And then perhaps a lesser told story about the loneliness that many people in their 20s feel. This character, Kate, she's had all sorts of burning ambitions of being a writer, being a journalist, but she's kind of lost her way a little, and she's lost a sort of sense of who she is. Now, I believe the author lived in Brixton. She doesn't live there anymore, but she lived in Brixton when she was a student, and just felt it was a really special, diverse area with this very strong community spirit. But at the same time, this vibrant community is being chipped away at because of the process of gentrification. Tina, what did you think of the book?
I quite enjoyed aspects of it. I felt that it had a real pulse. I love the community aspect and Rosemary's belonging and her anchoring. And one of the bars, a very vibrant bar that she takes herself to, was in fact the old library. And I really liked that link. And the fact that she could trace back her timeline with her husband George, from their young days, and her life in Brixton and her work, and the Lido was linked with every aspect of that, going in as a child, and she had some lovely memories of how they leapt into the pool in their raincoats, and really very lovely anchoring that you could sort of follow her story and her path along.
I agree.
And because of this sad closure of the library, she was desperate for the Lido not to close, and this really was her sense of passion. It was such a huge part of her life, and she just couldn't face the idea of life without it, because it was such a link to George, wasn't it? Yes, exactly. And this unusual friendship that was struck up between the two, both needing each other for different reasons. And it was lovely to see how Kate's relationship and how she grew as a person through her friendship with Rosemary, and how her anxiety, she learnt to manage her anxiety through that relationship, didn't she?
I did think, yes, it was a light read, a pleasurable read. It was, all the loose ends were neatly tied up.
Yes.
In a way that perhaps in real life that doesn't happen. But it was a pleasure to read, and it did give me insight into this.
I think so. Community. I think you could really visualise it. I could really see it. I could imagine what it was like swimming outside in the summer with some summer rain. I could picture all the ducks on the pool, and so there were some real aspects of this that were really beautifully written.
Okay, we've been talking about The Lido by Libby Page, which was published in 2018 by Orion. The Librarian by Salley Vickers, also published in 2018 by Penguin. Of Mice and Men, published by, among others, Penguin. All of these are available through Hampshire Libraries and through our free download service BorrowBox. And if you read any of the books we've talked about today, let us know what you think by clicking the link in our podcast description, where you'll find details of all the books discussed. Thanks for listening to Love Your Library, the Hampshire Libraries podcast. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear other interviews and book recommendations.
We'd love to hear from you with any comments or thoughts. We'll always read and respond to any questions or suggestions. And do let us know if you've read and enjoyed any of the books we've talked about. And it would be great if you'd rate and review our podcast on iTunes, as this helps other people to find us.
Don't forget to come and see us. You'll always be welcomed, whether you're choosing your next book, taking a course, or getting involved in a community project. The best thing you can do to support your local library is to use it. I'm Kate Price-McCarthy.
And I'm Mary Stone.